Hey guys, what's happening? It's me, Toe, from at Toe Knows Everything on Instagram and at GTA Sportsplex, bringing you another original episode of the Toe Knows Everything CarCast. That's right, it's not a podcast, it's a CarCast. We're practicing social distancing, and I am trying to practice safe distancing from others. So this is why I am bringing you this podcast, which I usually do inside of my car here in the city of Vaughan. And this is a super special episode. I promised it yesterday. I have a lot of people messaging me about what is going on with this coronavirus in terms of economics and also other questions like, is the media being frank with us? And a lot of my sources, high-level sources, I won't get into which agencies, but I have a lot of contacts in a lot of high-level agencies are relaying information to me, and not to leak the information, but sort of open our eyes to what's going on with mainstream media, what they're being fed, and what the real information is, and what the real news is sometimes isn't conveyed on your TV channel or on your iPhone. So I want to bring you a little bit of this incredible news, which I just came to my attention actually because I was not aware of it, even though it was originally reported in the summer of 2019 that in one of our high security biolabs here in Canada in Winnipeg, there was a major breach, and a Chinese scientist was basically evicted because she was living in Winnipeg and working in Winnipeg, and eventually she was extradited. She went back to China and began working in China after working on top secret biological warfare, basically here in Canada for the Western world. So I want to bring you some of the information that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of and what's going on. And this isn't about China versus Canada versus the US. I have tons of Chinese friends and business contacts. I do business with the Chinese community all the time. Back in 2004, when I owned a private school here in Woodbridge, I actually was one of the first schools to implement Mandarin language instruction. And at that time, the predominantly Italian-Canadian population sort of fluffed it off and said, why do these kids need to learn this back in 2004? And I said, because this is the future of their economy. So we did teach Mandarin, and shout out to Miss May, our Mandarin teacher, who I still keep contact with. So it's not about the Chinese people. I love the Chinese people, but it is about governments, big governments, and some of the theories which are out there right now about this coronavirus. Judge for yourself, watch, be informed, make your own educated decisions. It's some food for thought. Obviously, take everything with a grain of salt. Hope you enjoy this one.
But the impact is just as costly. Both the US and China have lost billions of dollars in the continuing trade war, which has seen no signs of abating. And the impact is being felt all across the globe.
We're also taking long overdue steps to stand up to China's chronic trade abuses. Have to do it. Somebody had to do it.
也没有可以对中国人民颐使气指的教师爷。
From a dispute over unfair trade practices and intellectual theft,
the whole problem is that it's not just a trade issue.
To a technology war between two economic superpowers that has threatened to split the world into two.
I think the split will actually cause the curtains to come up.
Who will win this nationalistic fight for technological supremacy and dominance?
In July 2019, Django True was expelled, evicted from Canada's only level 4 biotech high security lab, which produced the Ebola vaccine. And there have been a lot of theories about why the Chinese scientist, who was highly regarded, was expelled and evicted and essentially removed from the country. And one of the theories is that espionage was at play, that she was basically transferring Canadian and Western secrets to the Chinese army and government, which is basically led by the military regime. So the Chinese have not denied or verified any of these claims, but one thing is for sure that the RCMP
Dr.
and
Django True
CISIS
has
were
been
looking into it.
recognized by the Governor General's Innovation Awards.
This work can't be done without teamwork.
She and the team at the National Microbiology Lab have been praised for developing an Ebola vaccine. But just over a week ago, Chu, her husband, and her students from China were evicted from Canada's only Level 4 lab, their security access revoked. Staff at the lab was told last Monday the couple is on leave and not to communicate with them.
So guys, coronavirus, who started it, who's responsible? Why has the spread been so far reaching? It's become a global epidemic, and you know what? People are starting to ask questions. Where did it originate? Why? The question why? Why is this virus so far reaching? Why is it into every country basically in the world now, not just the East, but also the Western world? So there's a lot of questions that people want answers to. And to sum it all up, this virus here, reported by CBC News this summer of 2019. Canada does have something called a Category 4 biotech lab, which basically means it's a high-tech lab where they basically work on vaccines, and they work on vaccines for high-level viruses like the Ebola virus. The Ebola virus vaccine was actually developed right here in Canada, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, at one of these level 4 biotech pharmaceutical centers. And they're regulated and monitored by Health Canada, and they are top secret, and you have some very high level scientists working in these labs. And the Ebola virus, like I said, the cure, the vaccine was developed at this lab by a Chinese scientist and her team from China. She actually lived in Winnipeg, in Canada, for a couple of years, working at the lab alongside other Canadian scientists and some scientists from around the world to develop that Ebola vaccine that was brought to market very quickly within less than a year's time when the Ebola outbreak happened back last year, more than a year ago, in parts of Africa. So this high-level Chinese scientist was praised by the Canadian government, and basically she was brought into the fold, given medals, honored at dinners, and then all of a sudden in April of last year, something happened where her credentials were basically taken away. Her laptop was taken away by RCMP and CISIS, which is the Canadian spy organization, and essentially she was removed from her position and sent back to China, and nothing was ever heard after that. There was one report on the CBC about this situation, and it was actually aired in the summer, and then it never got any play after that. So someone is
all this, of course, is unproven, but even microbiology, sometimes especially microbiology, can have issues that involve national security.
It's something CISIS has already warned about.
Canada is facing threats from foreign espionage, and not just in the traditional sense of trying to understand what our national security interests are and agencies are involved with, but threats to our economic security.
Canada's relation.
So the Chinese government takes back their scientists, and where do they have her working? In one of their level 4 high-tech biotech labs. And where are some of these labs located? Guess what? Wuhan province, the same place where we find the coronavirus outbreak, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak. So she's working at the level 4 lab there. Nothing else is heard of her. Nothing else is reported on other than that she was removed from her position in Canada, and the RCMP RCMP basically said that she is no longer a threat to Canadian security. And that is even contradicted in the CBC report, where another high-level security administrator says, listen, we should be worried about these biotech threats because they are legitimate, they are real, and if we don't take them seriously, sooner or later, it's going to come back to bite us in the butt. So we better take it seriously.
His relationship with China has been strained ever since the detention of a Huawei executive on a U.S. arrest warrant. Shortly after, China detained 2 Canadians, accusing them of stealing state secrets. This likely won't go over well and could even deepen the diplomatic divide. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So where does this story really begin? Well, the story begins with the election of President Trump, and really even before that. China has been a superpower for decades, but really they were the copycat manufacturing country of the world. And, you know, as their population grew over 1 billion to 1.5 billion, China wanted to be at the forefront of manufacturing. They wanted to be at the forefront of technology, and they were starting to lose at that game. They were a copycat country. They were great at replicating any kind of product, manufacture it, mass produce it, and sell it to the West. That was their thing. But with their president's new agenda, the actual China 2025 agenda, and you can look it up, China 2025, their whole goal was to be the leader and to be at the forefront of technology. They actually wanted to beat out Apple, they wanted to beat out Google, they wanted to beat out Amazon, and they did with a bunch of companies that they self-created, companies like Alibaba, other companies with self-driving car companies. They have a dozen of them. So they went ahead and they went full tilt. And one of their technology companies, which was making gains on Apple, it's actually the number 2 cell phone company in the world, Huawei, they were gaining ground, and they were developing a technology, the 5G technology, which if you have not heard about, you need to research it, because these satellites connected to this 5G technology is just unbelievable for artificial intelligence. It basically tracks our every movement, our behaviors, and makes algorithms about our behaviors. It predicts what we're going to do before we actually do it, and it is tracking us at all times. And what the goal was to dominate the 5G market. And Donald Trump was aware of this, and he was very worried that the Chinese would take control of mass communication in the West, especially in the USA, and they needed to do something to stop this. So Donald Trump actually implemented a bunch of basically things to stop the Chinese from taking mass control of our communications here in the West. So what does he do? He says the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start imposing big tariffs on Chinese products to slow down their manufacturing dominance. So he put on a 10% tariff on all goods. Very few goods were exempt, but most goods had a 10% tariff added to them, which made it more difficult for the Chinese to do business with the US. And that essentially triggered a giant superpower war between China and the USA, something greater than we've ever seen, bigger than Russia-USA Cold War. This is much, much bigger, especially since Russia seems to have allied with the Chinese. So to make a long story short, last year, the vice president of Hua basically was arrested in British Columbia, and she was arrested for espionage. This is the vice president of the second biggest telecommunication company in the world. She's arrested because the U.S. Lets Canada know that she is spying on Western companies, technology, and government, and so they arrest her. That starts a major war, and this is where the retribution comes into play for China. And China, believe me, did not take that lightly. So detaining her in Canada basically allied us with the U.S., and the U.S. and Canada were on the hit list for the Chinese government. And this is where basically, if you want to call it the revenge theory, sort of came to be. So there are several Chinese scientists working in Canada, and what better way to take down the Western economy? You don't need bombs, you don't need weapons, you don't need military on the ground. you take down a country's economy. And how do you do that? Through bioscience. So it's a long chain of events, but let me tell you, Trump has disdain for China for a whole bunch of reasons. He believes that China, who also holds most of the earth metals on Earth, a lot of the steel which you see in all of our buildings and condominiums in Toronto and North America is made of Chinese steel. This steel is imported from China. Other valuable metals like silver and copper come from China. So we are super reliant on the Chinese for all of these metals. And believe me, one of the reasons why Canada is such a wealthy country is because we have natural resources just like China does. And when you have natural resources like oil, etc., you can be a very wealthy nation, just as we've seen all of the oil producing nations are. China was sort of exempt from that oil production, so they had to figure out a different way to gain supremacy over the West and the US. And the way that they decided to do it was through technology, and that was going to be the way that they would ultimately dominate world economics, and they would globalize through technology, and 5G was the master plan. So take everything with a grain of salt, do your own research, but at the end of the day, the Chinese government has in one way or another contributed to what's happening today here in the global economic situation. And the coronavirus, if you look at the CBC report, it looks very probable that the origins could have been in Winnipeg in that lab. And, you know, Donald Trump accuses the Chinese of a lot of things. Like, one of the things he accuses them of is being the biggest fentanyl supplier of the US and Canada in the world. So, you know, back in the 80s, people used to talk about the Colombians as being the big drug traffickers. Well, Donald Trump says the biggest drug traffickers in the world are actually the Chinese, because they flooded the American market with the lethal killer drug fentanyl. And that is one of the things that he was trying to stop as well. So like him or hate him, you know, he had some good inside information as to what was going on, and he was trying to fight the fight against the Chinese government. And unfortunately, the Chinese government has flexed their muscle in a pretty, you know, diabolical way if they did originate this coronavirus. And if it did originate in a Canadian lab, that is pretty sad that the Canadian government let that happen and let it slip away. And another interesting fact, if you really want to know how crazy this world is, that Ebola virus and vaccine was actually transported from Winnipeg to Africa on a commercial jet. So just think about it. You could have been on an Air Canada plane flying out of Winnipeg to Africa, and there could have been a deadly virus, one of the most deadly in the world, the Ebola virus, on that commercial plane. And they also had the anecdote, mind you, they had the vaccine. But, you know, pretty incredible stuff that happens at a high level, which most average people never know about. Food for thought, do your own research, check it out on the CBC. Level 4 Biotech Lab in Winnipeg, they reported on it, and then it went silent. No other news agency reported on it. I'm reporting it to you here. I want you to investigate for yourself. It is very probable that the coronavirus could have originated in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Whole bunch of reasons I could go on for hours, but you make your own judgments. At the end of the day, Canada, the USA, and China, as well as Russia, are embroiled in this global race for technology and telecommunication dominance. Who is going to dominate 5G? Right now it looks like China is, and they've already started. If you look at the news in the last 2 weeks, how ironic is that in the last 2 weeks 5G was rolled out. Super high-speed internet. It's instantaneous. There's no lag time with 5G. So these satellites are flying around up in space, and there are like 100 of them that basically track your every movement, collecting all your information, all your movement information, all your likes, dislikes, and putting it into an algorithm and figuring out your next move. It's pretty incredible stuff. Look it up for yourself. Make your own judgments. At the end of the day, people, the government is Big Brother, and they are watching us more than ever with 5G. And if you think 5G is great because you're going to get quicker internet, yeah, you're going to get quicker internet at the cost of your civil liberties. If you're okay with that, giving up your civil liberties for faster internet service, then albeit. But I'll tell you something, we are losing our own individuality very quickly, because Big Brother and government is starting to monitor our every move, literally. Take it from me, Toe Knows Everything on Instagram. Go to my website, www.toeknowseverything.com. This was a special CarCast report. We'll bring you more reports. As long as we're in quarantine, we're coming live from the car. We want to be safe and practice social distancing. Have an amazing day. Stay safe. Stay healthy. We're going to get through this. But people, you got to start thinking for yourself. Have an amazing day. We'll talk to you soon.